Today I would like to talk with you about private peace entrepreneurs and conflict resolution process. As she said, this is my PhD research. But actually I would like to start with a story of a play that was written by Aristophanes, the Acharnians. And it's a story about a farmer from Athens that during the war with Sparta, he escaped from his village together with his family, like many others, and he decided to go to the citizen assembly in order to promote a discussion about how to achieve peace and how to end the war. And to his surprise, in the citizen assembly, nobody wanted to listen to him. And it seems that everybody there supported the continuation of the war. So he initiated a private appeal to Sparta, and he signed a private peace treaty between him and his family and Sparta. And this is, of course, a fictional story. It's not a real story, but it represents a real international historical phenomenon that I would like to talk about, and this is the private peace entrepreneurs. And this is the definition. Private peace entrepreneurs are private citizens with no official authority to outline or to conduct foreign policy. Nobody nominated them, nobody elected them to do that. Second, they belong to one of the disputing sides. So we are not talking about someone from outside, an actor from outside trying to interfere in a conflict. They are actually part of the conflict. They are local actors. And third, they create some kind of an unofficial channel with officials from the other side of the conflict. So it's different from track 2 diplomacy or people to people, that is citizen with citizen. Here we are talking about individual private citizen approaching the official leadership in the other side, when the goal is to promote process of conflict resolution. And it can go through a long spectrum from resolving a specific crisis to drafting a comprehensive peace agreement. So this is the definition. Just a few words about the theoretical background. We can see that in the literature of international relations and conflict resolution and peace studies, we can see different theoretical framework and research fields that are very close, very relevant to this phenomenon of private peace entrepreneurs. For example, first of all, new actors in diplomacy that we can see in diplomatic studies during the second half of the 20th century. Many scholars identify changes in diplomatic landscapes and the emergence of new actors, including unofficial and non-governmental organizations that are now part of diplomacy, and claiming that the official diplomat no longer have the monopoly over diplomacy, over the diplomatic process. The second, of course, from peace studies is the track 2 diplomacy. The term track 2 is referring to a wide spectrum of meeting between private citizens from both sides of the conflict. And we can see different types of track 2 diplomacy. And the main goal is to assist in some way the track 1, the official negotiation track. And we can talk, for example, about different types like meeting between students, meeting between religious leaders, meeting between businessmen. That's why we can see the scholars use the term multi-track diplomacy later on, not just track 2, also 3 and 4 and 5, and so on. And just the last one, it's from the IR, International Relations literature, it's the transnational civil society. This is a literature that we can see, especially since the end of the Cold War, dealing with transnational movement and organizations that include activists from all over the world, sharing the same goals, sharing the same ideas, trying to change policy, trying to promote a specific idea. It can be about human rights, it can be about economy, environment. We can talk, for example, about the campaign of Bono about Africa, the campaign about landmines of Judy Williams, and many others. Going back to the private peace entrepreneurs, one of the questions that I'm dealing with in my research is about sources of power and authority. Because the fact that we are talking about private citizens with no official authority, without military or economic or diplomatic resources that states, for example, have, or international organizations, it raises the question, what are their alternative unofficial sources of power and authority that help them to influence diplomacy and to promote conflict resolution? So in order to clarify this question, I would like to use two quotes about two different case studies of private peace entrepreneurs from different conflicts. The first one is from Northern Ireland. This is Father Alec Reid that played a role in promoting the peace process in Northern Ireland already in the 80s. And he was the one who created the first contact between Gerry Adams and John Hume in Northern Ireland. And the historian Tim Pat Coogan wrote a lot about the conflicts and the peace process in Northern Ireland, wrote that he was amazed how much had been achieved by one man armored in nothing but goodness and lonely belief. And this is the first quote. The second quote is from the Israeli-Palestinian context, and this is the Hudna initiative that took place during the Second Intifada, the beginning of Second Intifada, 2001-2002. And it was initiated by 3 Israelis private citizens. One of them you can see here, Lior Lehrs. He's a businessman. Nobody heard about him in Israel before that. And their main goal of the Hudna initiative was to take the idea of a Hudna, that it's a truce in the Muslim Arab culture and to translate it into the diplomatic context, in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And actually, eventually, it became an official policy. After something like a year, it became a basis for an official negotiation. And after that, two Israeli journalists, Nahum Barnea and Shimon Schiffer, wrote an article about the Hudna Initiative. And they are wondering how three people with no official status, only good intention, a lot of time, can start a multinational move and bypass all the players who got paid for this job. So this is actually the question: what are their power sources? So I will try to answer this question by presenting a few types of power sources of private peace entrepreneurs and also use different case studies. The first type is resources of knowledge, expertise, and ideas. The fact that the private peace entrepreneurs have meetings and discussions and contact with officials from the other side of the conflict can provide them a very important knowledge resources. And in cases when there are no official channels, no official relation between two sides in the conflict, it can be an exclusive knowledge resource and it can be a very important power resource. This is, for example, a case study of Susan Massey, an American writer that was an expert for Russian culture during the 80s, during the Cold War. And she visited Russia frequently, and she had a lot of contact there, including Gorbachev. And at some point, the Reagan administration started to consult with her, and even to use her sometimes as a back channel between Reagan and Gorbachev. And we can see that it was based mainly on her knowledge resources, and we can see that Reagan and Schultz, the Secretary of State, wrote in their memoir that they saw Massey as an expert and authority about the Soviet Union, and they also wrote that they learned from her about different angles and different perspectives about Soviet Union that they couldn't see in the official intelligence briefing. Another source is the resources of access and contacts to decision makers, to power circles, and it can be on one side of the conflict, it can be on both sides of the conflict. And a good example for that is Professor Muhammad Wabi, an American Palestinian professor, who had, during the 80s, on one hand, he had very good access to the leadership of the PLO that was in Tunis back then. He knew some of them personally for many, many years. He studied together with them, a good personal relation with some of them. And on the other hand, he had good access to the State Department and to National Security Council. And he was able, based on that, to create the first contact, to create some kind of a channel of communication between the United States and the PLO to talk about moving to the condition to create official relation and official negotiation between the United States and the PLO in 1988. And when we're talking about these resources of access, I think it's especially important in the context of conflict between a state and a non-state actors, like paramilitary organization or terrorist organization, when sometimes government want or needs some kind of a back channel with this kind of organization, the non-state actors. And of course, this is something that official diplomacy, it's very hard for them to do. So if there is a private peace entrepreneurs with access to these kind of non-state actors, it can be a very important power resources. And this is a very nice example. Gershon Baskin is an Israeli peace activist for many, many years. And he had a channel of communication with the Hamas leadership in Gaza. And at some point in 2011, when the Israeli government wanted to promote negotiation with Hamas for releasing the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit that was captured in Gaza, they decided to use this unofficial channel of Gershon Baskin with the Hamas. And actually, this channel played an important role, leading to an agreement a few months after that to exchange prisoners and to release the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. We can also talk about resources of moral and spiritual authority. And here I think we can talk mainly about two models. The first one is the intellectual authority. And also here we have an example for the Israeli-Palestinian. This is Yehuda Leib Magnes, that was the first president of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And during the British mandate, he was involved in different peace talks and peace initiatives with Palestinians and with Arabs. And even though he was not part of the official leadership, and more than that, his position was very controversial, and most of the Zionist leadership was against his position, but all the different actors in the field, the Americans, the British, the Palestinians, the Jews, and the Arabs, consider him as an important actor in the diplomatic field, mainly because of his intellectual authority as the first president of the first university in Israel-Palestine. The second model is, of course, the religious authority. That is very important, and we can see many cases of religious private peace entrepreneurs. And this is just one example from Mozambique, Archbishop Jaime Gonzalez, that again, as a religious leader, both sides in the conflict trusted him, the government and the Renamo organization, and he plays some kind of a role as a mediator between the government and the Renamo organization in the peace process at the beginning of the 90s, leading to an agreement in 92. and he was, of course, used his resources as a religious leader. We can also add to that instrumental power resources, for example, the power of secrecy. The fact that they are private citizens, they can go freely from wherever, they can move from one capital to another to have secret meetings, to exchange messages between leaders without raising question, without raising suspicion, without the media will notice, without the knowledge of the public. And it can be a very important power resources when there is a need for a secret negotiation channel. And it's of course different if we are talking about an official diplomat. We can also talk about the power of deniability, that they can say to the leaders, you have nothing to lose. If it will fail, if it will leak, you can always distance yourself, you can deny connection, you can say I have nothing to do with it, it's a private citizen. But if you succeed, you can always use it as a tool, as an official tool to promote conflict resolution. It is of course different from official diplomat. And another important question that I'm dealing with in my research is the complex relationship between these private citizens, these private peace entrepreneurs, and the official leadership, the official establishment, the decision makers. And of course, it's a very important point trying to understand the impact and the influence of these private citizens. And we can see that at the heart of this relationship between these two actors, there is a structural tension, because we are talking on the one hand about the official leadership, the decision makers that of course think that they have the monopoly, they have the authority to decide about peace and war. And on the other hand, we have these private actors trying to challenge that, trying to interfere in this and trying to create his own private diplomacy. And of course, in many cases, we can see clash between these private citizens and the leadership. This is a nice cartoon for the case of Nahum Goldman. We call it the Goldman Affair, 1970 in Israel. Again, Israel and Egypt. Nahum Goldman, you can see here, was an Israeli private peace entrepreneur that was invited to visit Cairo in Egypt and to meet with the president of Egypt, Abdel Nasser, and it was during the war of attrition between Israel and Egypt. And he told about it to the Israeli prime minister back then, Golda Meir, and after a discussion in the government, she told him not to go to Cairo. And later on it was published, and it was a big debate in Israel about it and demonstration. And here you can see in the cartoon that Golda Meir, the prime minister, is telling Goldman, thank you, but I have my own phone. Meaning, please do not interfere, I have my own foreign office, my own channels, official channel. We don't need your help, so please stay away from it. And so based on the empirical research I did on different case studies from different conflicts and different periods, I actually found three main response patterns that we can see dealing with the establishment attitude toward the private peace entrepreneurs' activities and efforts. So the first one that I already mentioned is, of course, resistance, that we can see in many cases that the government is trying to fight against them, to prevent this kind of activity, to stop them. I just mentioned the case of Golda Meir and Nahum Goldman, but there are many other cases. And we can see that governments using different tools to fight them. For example, using legal tools. In Israel, for example, in the 80s, it was against the law to meet, for private citizens to meet with the PLO leader that will consider, of course, the PLO is the Palestinian organization that was considered as a terrorist organization. And there are some people, for example, Abi Natan, that was an Israeli peace activist that met with Yasser Arafat, that was the head of the PLO, and he went twice to jail because it was against the law just to meet with the PLO. And according to the legislation that was in Israel in '86, you don't need to prove that it caused damage to the security, just the fact that they had a meeting, it's enough that he will go to jail. And also in the United States, there is the Logan Act, that it still exists until today. It's since 1799. And according to the Logan Act, it's prohibiting for American private citizens to negotiate or to contact foreign government. And actually, it's interesting that the Logan Act is a result of a private peace initiative of George Logan. It's a very interesting historical case study of private peace entrepreneurs in 1798, that during a crisis between the United States and France, he traveled to France in order to try to prevent a war between the states. When he came back, the result was the legislation of the Logan Act that, as I said, exists until today, even though nobody was charged ever with basis on the Logan Act. But sometimes we heard some threats. For example, when Jesse Jackson went to Syria, some people threatened to use it, and sometimes when Carter went to North Korea. And also recently we heard about it during the debates about the relationship with Comey and Russia, but this is, of course, different, but it still exists, the Logan Act. Another option of the government is to use restriction on movement. And this is something that we saw, for example, during the Vietnam War. There were some peace activists, American peace activists, that went to Vietnam, tried to meet with the leadership in North Vietnam, trying to promote peace negotiation to end the Vietnam War. And this is one case, Professor Stoughton Lin, that went to Hanoi in 1965. When he came back to the United States, his passport was confiscated, saying that he went to an enemy state. He's not allowed to go to an enemy state using an American passport. So this is another tool. And the last one is, of course, using discursive tool, trying to legitimize the private peace entrepreneurs, trying to discredit them, to attack them, sometimes to say that they are naive, and sometimes to say that they are, of course, also traitors. And we can see an example for that in South Africa during the 80s, during the apartheid regime, when there were some private peace entrepreneurs who met with the leadership of the ANC, the African National Congress. One example is Alex Bouen, and after there was a famous meeting in Dakar in '87, and after he came back from a meeting with the ANC, the government official attacked him that he's not patriotic, that he crossed the line, that he's a traitor, and this is something that we see using a discursive tool. The second pattern is, I call it indifference, is something in between, when we can see that the government is not trying to fight against them, but they're also not to support them, not to use them. And sometimes maybe they even agree to listen to the reports about the meeting, but not to show any sign that they are supporting it. And I found a very interesting case. One of the cases that I'm dealing with in my research is also in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There was an Israeli journalist, Uri Avneri, that started the first meeting between Israeli private citizens in the 70s, in the middle of the 70s, with the PLO. And he went to the Israeli prime minister, that was Yitzhak Rabin, that was his first term, and he said, I have this meeting with the PLO. And Rabin told him a very interesting thing. He said, I'm against negotiating with the PLO. They are a terrorist organization. I will never talk with them. But you're a private citizen. You can do whatever you want. And if you have interesting thing to tell me, the door is open. You can always come. So this is a very interesting approach. And it's interesting to say that Rabin was the one that 20 years after that signed the agreement with the PLO, the Oslo Agreement. But it happened many years before that. And the third one, and this is of course specifically interesting, and this is the endorsement. And here we can see in these cases that the government not just support these kind of activities, but also try to use it as a tool to promote conflict resolution. And in my research, I was specifically interested in these kind of cases because here we can see the meeting point between the unofficial sphere and the official. You can see how activities that started as unofficial activities translated later on to an official policy, an official negotiation. And it's a proof that they have some kind of an impact on the official sphere. So we can see also that the endorsement can be done in different ways. For example, sometimes the government used them to deliver messages, to use them as some kind of a back channel. Because they had access to the other side, let's use it, like I mentioned, for example, with Gershon Baskin in the Hamas. Of course, the Israel and the Hamas don't have any relation, don't have any official relation, so they can use Gershon Baskin that have access to the other side. And another very interesting case that I did in my research, this is Brandon Daddy from Northern Ireland. And he was a businessman from Derry, and he had a fish and chip restaurant. And at some point during the 70s, he had access to the leadership of the IRA, to the Irish Republican movement, and he told about it to the British side, and there was some official in the British side that decided at some point to use him to deliver messages between the IRA and the British. And actually for something like 20 years, in different periods between the 70s until the beginning of the 90s, they used him as some kind of a quasi-mediator, as Professor Kreis will call it, maybe something as a back channel between them. It was a very interesting case, and the interesting thing that it was completely secret. Nobody knew about it. Only a few years after the peace agreement, it was published, and there was a movie about him, but nobody knew about it during the conflict. Sometimes also endorsement can be done in using ideas or proposals that were raised by the private peace entrepreneurs. It can be immediately after the initiative, it can be even after a few years. I mentioned, for example, the case of the Hudna that started as an unofficial idea, later on moved to the official sphere. I will just say that we can see in different conflicts that sometimes for the government it's very hard to deal with sensitive issues that are very sensitive in the public opinion. Tomorrow I'll talk about Jerusalem. It's a very good example that always the Israeli government was really afraid, all the government agencies, afraid to think about creative ideas about Jerusalem because it was very, very sensitive in the public space. Because of that, we can see that when in Camp David, July 2000, when Camp David summit, when Israel was supposed to start the negotiation in Jerusalem, they didn't have any material about it, any official material to deal with because the government was afraid to deal with, so they used only material of unofficial actors. So we can see that it's important that unofficial actor will create some kind of a creative ideas, creative solution, and one day the government maybe can use it. And the last one, this is maybe the dream of every private peace entrepreneur, is to receive some kind of authorization, to become some kind of an official, to receive an official authority. And of course, it's very, very rare to see these cases. But I will just mention that the case of Oslo channel between Israel and the PLO in 1993 actually started as an unofficial channel between two academics that were close to Yossi Beilin and Peres, and actually later on it became an official channel. And then they added two official diplomats, but the two unofficial diplomats stay as part of the Israeli team. Just for conclusion, I would like to say that if we are trying to analyze this phenomenon of private peace entrepreneurs, we can see, of course, that on the one hand, there are very important advantages, and I mentioned some of the power resources that they have, that because of that, they can be a very important and useful tool in promoting conflict resolution, in promoting negotiation, in promoting peace process. And I found, for example, that in my empirical research, that especially they are important in the phase of what we call pre-negotiation phase, when there are no official channel, no official recognition, no official relation, and you need what I call the diplomatic avant-garde. You need someone to be the first one to create the first contact, to create the first channel. And I found that in many conflicts in Israel, Palestine, in Northern Ireland, South Africa, and Vietnam, first came the citizen. They create the first contact, and later on, the official came after that. So we can see that they can have an important role. On the other hand, of course, it's important to say that there are a lot of problems and a lot of challenges and a lot of criticism against this kind of activities. And I will just mention three main arguments. First of all, the first argument in the criticism against them is that they are not professional and amateurs. They don't have the abilities, they don't have the training to be diplomats. So it's very dangerous to let them deal with such a sensitive issues of peace and war. They are not official diplomats, they don't have the tool and abilities to deal with it. The second argument is that they are undermining the ability of a government, sometimes elected government, to conduct a unified policy. So according to this argument, if the government is saying we are not negotiating with this organization or with this state, it's not appropriate for a private citizen to go and to do the opposite. This is the argument. And the third thing is about public legitimacy, claiming that they don't have public legitimacy, they do not represent anyone, they represent only themselves. They decided to go and to start to be some kind of a diplomat, an ambassador, without asking no one. And according to this argument, they are saying if you want to change the official policy, you should create a party, you should run for an election or something like that, and then you can change the policy, but as a private citizen, you cannot do it. So this is part of the debate about private peace entrepreneurs, so there are also arguments against it and criticism. And I will just mention, this is the last point I would like to say, is that I think that this discussion about private citizen as a peacemakers, and also in general, the private citizen as a diplomatic actor in general, in diplomacy, in world politics, I think it's a very important discussion because it raises a very important question. It challenges some of the basic assumptions that we know in international relations, and it raises important questions, for example, the question about authority and representation in the world after all the changes that took place in diplomacy. It raises questions about civil society and democracy under condition of conflict and war, and about the meaning of citizenship in the contemporary world. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or...
Could you say more about your last point? You said it raises a couple questions. One is the role of citizenship. Could you talk more about what you're thinking there?
Yeah, so doing my research, I found that it's actually not relevant just to conflict resolution, not just to diplomacy. It actually raises a lot of questions. And sometimes following the public discourse about different peace initiatives, you can see that there are also other questions. For example, one of the things I said is about civil society and democracy under condition of war. For example, what a citizen can do if we are in a situation of a conflict. If we are not in a situation of conflict, everyone can go wherever they want. Just recently, if you hear the news, there was going to be election in the Labour a few months. So there was someone that is a candidate to be the head of the Labour that he met with someone who is a Palestinian, with Jibril Rajub. And we can see that recently in the last day, there is a lot of debate in Israel if it's okay for some of our private citizens to meet with the Palestinians that they are still the enemy. And this is, of course, I think the question of democracy under conflict, what we consider okay, is what we consider not okay. And also the question about, that I raised also the question of authority, what exactly when we are so in authority. In the past we have, the ambassadors, it was very clear, we have the official diplomacy, but I think it's very clear that things changed since then, and the world changed, and after the globalization, I talked about transnational networks, and I think that today everything is changed, and we are not talking about just a few men, usually men in the 19th century of the diplomacy, they can decide about everything. I think today everything is much more open. There is public diplomacy, there is citizen diplomacy, and I think everything is changing, so this is part of it. One of the things that I found in my research that we are talking about an old phenomenon. We are not talking about just new thing that happened because of globalization, but we can see that because of globalization, it's much easier for people to reach out to the other side. For example, I mentioned Gershon Baskin with Hamas. He talked, even though there is a fence that it's almost impossible for Israel to go to Gaza, they can talk in chat, in emails, and it's very, very easy. And sometimes the SMS. So because of the globalization, because of the changes in technology, it's much easier. I mentioned George Logan in the 18th century. He needed to go a few days, almost weeks, in order to get to France. And now it's much easier. So I think all these changes change everything when we are talking about diplomacy. Other questions?
Another one, if never mind. You were framing track 2 as more citizen to citizen versus citizen approaching.
Some people call it track 1.5 or something like that. Yeah.
Okay. I guess I've thought of track 2 as potentially broader than that. So where would you put like problem-solving workshops and stuff like that?
Yeah, so actually, one of the things that I found that using the word track 2 for different thing for different people. That's why later on we can see track 3, track 4, track 5. And I see that there is a difference, some people say, between track 2 that is soft and track 3 that it's not soft, it's more trying to affect. This is maybe more closer to that. But usually I think problem solving, it's really different cases, but I think it's usually more track 2 and citizen with citizen, and sometimes there is someone from outside that organizing that, the workshop of Kalman and things like that. So it's a bit different from that, because here the active actor is inside the conflict and is approaching the other side without the help of anybody. Mm-hmm. And what this workshop did is someone from outside is inviting Israelis and Palestinians, for example, to a workshop and doing this track 2 diplomacy. But it's different, it's kind of different, even though, for example, some of the people I wrote, for example, about Norman Cousins that had a meeting with Khrushchev, but he was also involved in track 2 in Dartmouth, meeting with Soviets. So sometimes these actors can be involved in different activities in track 2, but also track 1.5. But what the important thing was for me to talk about the individual actor as someone from inside the conflict that he's approaching the other side. But I agree that track 2 is a very problematic, people use it in different ways. I completely agree. That's why we can see a lot of track 3 and track 1.5 and things like that. And citizen diplomacy and private diplomacy, yeah. But I agree that it's very relevant. And many things that I did in my research is very relevant for the discussion about track 2. Yeah. Yeah.
I take it one goal of this kind of research is to say a lot of people could do this, and it really can be effective, which is worth, I think, many people in the field of conflict resolution. That's what we want to do, is to say that we don't have to go down the path of destructive relations, and sometimes very little actions have larger consequences. It's a story that certainly needs to be spread. I was wondering about the role of diasporas.
The diaspora?
The diaspora people, they're in a position to be a reservoir of people who could play such role, but very often the diaspora are not so interested in peace, but in intensifying the war, the conflict, because they feel stronger even than the people who left, who had enough already. And I don't know whether, in your research, the whole matter of the role of diaspora people?
So one of the things that I did in my research is to try to create this mapping of different types of private peace entrepreneurs. It can be, for example, journalists, it can be a businessman, it can be academic, and one of the type is the diaspora private peace entrepreneurs. I mentioned, for example, Nahum Goldman, that part of the time was in the United States, and also Professor Muhammad Rabi, that was a Palestinian living in the United States. And I was dealing also with that. So the first thing is, as you said, most of the time you consider the diaspora, you consider it in different conflicts, with Israel-Palestine, also in Armenia and other conflicts, that they are more extreme and usually they are not supporting peace, as supporting the other part. But I found a few cases, like I mentioned, and you can see that sometimes they have a very important resources because they are, for example, Muhammad Rabi is living outside. So it's outside of the conflict. It's very close, for example, to the State Department or to the National Security Council, and he has some abilities that someone that's living in the West Bank, for example, don't have. And also, Nahum Goldman had a lot of other resources. The problem is that, for example, when Nahum Goldman tried to promote this meeting with Nasser, a lot of people say, "You are not one of us. If you want, you need to live with here." That's what Golda Meir said publicly. You cannot criticize us if you are living abroad. If you want, you need to live here in the area that people feel suffering the terror and terrorists, and then you can talk about peace and things like that. So this is problem. This is on the one hand, they have some resources, but on the other hand, there is some problem with criticism against them. I will just say about the first point that you mentioned, that this is actually the reason why I started this research, that I found it was really interesting for me living in a conflict area in Jerusalem. I was wondering how private citizens, that for most of the people, I think, in a conflict area, you feel that this is a natural phenomenon. This is something that will stay forever. It's like earthquake. There's nothing you can do about it. So it was interesting for me to find these private citizens and decided, first of all, that it can change, that I think most of the people usually think that it cannot. And not just that, they think that they can change it. It's very, very interesting. Sometimes you need to be a man with a lot of ego or a woman to be able to, in order that you think that you can change it. And you can see that they are very interesting character of people. It's another issue, the psychology behind that, how they think that they are the one, that everybody were waiting for them to start to do it. So this is another point, but this is one of the reasons that I was trying to see first of all, to show that they have impact. First of all, of course, many of the cases failed, but some cases they can have impact. Sometimes it can be maybe small, but important. So this is one of the things that I wanted to show in my...
So I'll give you an anecdote of when we conflict resolution programs were beginning here in the United States. The first one was at Harvard, and the leader of that was Roger Fisher, international lawyer. And I remember at one conference of the founding organizations, he was explaining how easy this was to get involved. You call somebody up in one country and you chat with them a little bit, and then you call somebody in this other country and you say, "I was just talking to so-and-so, and he said this. What would you say to that?" And he said, "Pretty soon you're mediating," which shows you chutzpah and humorous. That was remarkable, but that was Roger Fisher.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages that they have that they are local actors, so they are familiar with all the problem and how much it's complex. They're not someone coming from Norway saying, "Oh, maybe it's easy and I will try to mediate." They know all the complexities and they are part of it. Yeah.
I mean, one of the downsides, as you said, is a lack of a unified sort of policy position because these are private actors. Is there a way that governments or a government can sort of work with them in a sense to sort of get some of its voice out there through them? One thing is clear, that people are less trusting of governments nowadays and more trusting of people. So people-to-people, person-to-person diplomacy is really the way to go in trying to get through difficult positions such as peace processes, as it were.
Yeah, one of the things when I talked at the beginning about the relation between the leadership and these kind of people, that usually they don't like them. They want to do it themselves. They have their I showed the cartoon with Golda Meir. She said, please do not interfere. I have my own foreign office. We don't want private citizens to interfere. So usually they don't like that people are doing it. But you can see that sometimes they have some advantages of using private citizens to do something that they are afraid to do. And then, as I said, they can always, if it will fail, they can always say I have nothing to do with it. So sometimes it's a very good advantage to use them, to send them to do some kind of a mission. And then if it will fail, they can always say I have nothing to do with it. If it will succeed, they did it. And then they can. And by the way, usually the people remember the leadership, not the one. For example, Oslo, I mentioned, the two first academics, nobody remembered the Yair Hirschfeld and Ron Pundak. And Shimon Peres, that everybody remembered that he did Oslo, he didn't mention even their name in the book that he wrote about Oslo. Because he thought that he is the most important, he and Rabin maybe. But they forgot about the little people that actually started all this process. So, of course, also Rabin and Peres, they're the one that decided about it. They are the leadership, but sometimes this is also about the issue of historiography of peace, that who exactly do you remember at the end of the process. Also Brendan Daddy, that just after the peace agreement, people are talking about it, but before that, nobody knew about his role in the peace process.
Okay. Let us thank you very much for a
Thank
very
you.
interesting presentation.
Thank you very much.